us courageous to embrace the changes that are needed in search of the common good.
Wonderful. Thank you. All right. So, chapter 1, What's Happened to Our Common Home, is made up of 8 parts. And I'm going to touch on each. And as I move through the presentation, I'd ask that you might want to jot down aspects that you might have questions about that we can address either after this meeting or maybe at some future time. And this really is a synopsis of the Pope's encyclical. And please, again, excuse me as I simply read the slides. These are the Pope's words, and I don't want to inject too much of my own stuff. Really, the only thing I inject are the pictures. That's my commentary. So this continued acceleration of changes affecting humanity and the planet is coupled today with a more intensified pace of life and work, which might be called rapidification. Although change is part of the working of complex systems, the speed with which human activity has developed contrasts with the naturally slow pace of biological evolution. This rapid and constant change, let's see, there's somebody I need to admit. This rapid and constant change are not necessarily geared to the common good or to the integral and sustainable human development. And I've got a chart there that kind of shows how change is happening so fast in this day and age. So in chapter 1, he says, let us review, however cursorily, those questions which are troubling us today and which we can no longer sweep under the carpet, not to amass information, but to become painfully aware, to dare to turn what is happening to the world into our own personal suffering, and thus to discover what each of us can do about it. So exposure to atmospheric pollutants produces a broad spectrum of health hazards. And this is pollution that affects everyone. Technology is presented in many circles as the only way to solve these problems. Each year, hundreds of millions of tons of waste are generated, much of it non-biodegradable, highly toxic, and some of it radioactive, from homes and businesses, from construction and demolition sites, from clinical, electronic, and industrial sources. The Earth, our home, is beginning to look more and more like an immense pile of filth. So we have not yet managed, the way that natural ecosystems work is exemplary. And he says we have not yet managed to adopt a circular model of production capable of preserving resources for present and future generations. Our industrial system at the end of its cycle of production and consumption has not developed the capacity to absorb and reuse wastes and byproducts. So he speaks of the climate as a common good. He says, at the global level, it is a complex system linked to many of the essential conditions for human life. And we're presently witnessing a disturbing warming of the climatic system. And this is due to the great concentration of greenhouse gases, as we can see in the hockey stick chart that maybe many of us are familiar with. And it's based on the intensive use of fossil fuels. Look at the massive uses of fossil fuel compared to renewables, which is only 9.3% worldwide. So we're melting the polar ice caps. I've shown this slide before. This is a recent slide of how what we predicted is happening faster than we expected. And we're losing tropical forests due to deforestation. This map shows where the tropical forests are. And those are so important. Those are the lungs. The Pope tells us those are the lungs of our planet. And he says increases in acidification of the oceans. And this is a map where the warming, it's a heat map of the oceans. So the warming is a result that oceans absorb 80 to 90% of CO2 emissions. And then the Pope says, if the present trends continue, this century may well witness extraordinary climate change and an unprecedented destruction of ecosystems. Now, I've probably shown this slide before too, because I go around doing a lot of environmental presentations. This is what the United States is going to look like by mid-century if we do little in the middle, and if we do nothing in the middle, and if we do little on the right. So in 2050, we're going to have 50 to 100 days over 100 degrees right here in eastern Kansas, 25 to 50 over 105 degrees, and 1 to 20 that are off the charts, more than 105 degrees. So extraordinary climate change. The Pope is not off base. And a rise in sea level. And a quarter of the world's populations lives on the coasts. This is a map from National Geographic showing what the United States will look like if we melt the polar ice caps. That's not necessarily imminent, but it's an eventuality, and particularly if things get run away. The worst impact will probably be felt by developing countries, largely dependent on natural reserves such as agriculture, fishing, and forestry. They have no other financial activities or resources which can enable them to adapt to climate change, or access to social services and protection is very limited. And of course, this is what the world, these areas in red will be uninhabitable by the year 2070 if serious action is not taken and soon. And you probably get a sense that I'm really trying to stress the urgency of this problem. It is a massive problem that we're ignoring and that we're pretending like doesn't exist. The Pope says it represents one of the principal challenges facing humanity in our day. So changes in climate lead plants and animals to migrate, which in turn affects the livelihood of the poor. And you know, we're already seeing it, and there's widespread indifference to such suffering, which is taking place now throughout the world. In the next chapter, he talks about water. Water supplies used to be relatively constant. Now, demand exceeds the sustainable supply, and they have to bring it in from elsewhere. Water poverty especially affects Africa, where large sections of the population have no access to safe drinking water, and droughts impede agriculture. Underground water sources in many places are threatened by the pollution produced in certain mining, farming, and industrial activities. A growing tendency, despite its scarcity, is to privatize this resource, turning it into a commodity. Gene, I'm gonna, if I can figure out how to do it, I'm gonna mute you.
Oh,
there we go. I figured out how to do it. And I'll unmute you after we get a little further along. Some studies warn that an acute water shortage may occur within a few decades unless urgent action is taken. The Pope says, our world has a grave social debt towards the poor who lack access to drinking water because they are denied the right to a life consistent with their inalienable dignity. This debt can be paid partly by an increase in funding to provide clean water and sanitary services among the poor. And then in the third chapter, we're seeing the disappearance of thousands of plant and animal species, and it's related to human activity. Because of us, thousands of species will no longer give glory to God by their very existence. And our children will never see them. He also sees the loss of fungi and algae and worms and insects and reptiles and an innumerable variety of microorganisms due to agrotoxins like Roundup. So, you know, in assessing any project, concern is usually shown for the effects on soil, water, and air, which is important, yet few careful studies are made of its impact on biodiversity. So some alternatives do exist. We can do things like biological corridors, but little attention is paid to studying the reproductive patterns of all of the various creatures in God's creation. And the Pope says we need to do that if we're to save them. And we need to be looking for sanctuaries on land and in the oceans. So caring for ecosystems demands farsightedness. And since no one looking for a quick and easy profit is truly interested in their preservation, we can be silent witnesses to this terrible injustice if we think we can obtain significant benefits by making the rest of humanity, present and future, pay the extremely high costs of environmental deterioration. So the Pope's getting on us a little bit. He says oceans are threatened for various reasons. Life in rivers, lakes, seas, and oceans is affected by uncontrolled fishing. Coral reefs, comparable to the great forests on dry land, shelter approximately 1 million species. Human beings, too, are creatures of this world in chapter 4. We cannot fail to consider the effects on people's lives of environmental deterioration, current models of development, and the throwaway culture. And then he talks about the privatization of certain spaces on Earth that are of particular beauty. It makes me think, you know, Ted Turner has 1 million acres in southeastern Colorado, and nobody can go in there. It's just his. You know, beautiful and carefully manicured green spaces exist, but not in the more hidden areas where the disposable of society live. So the effects of technological innovations have had bad effects on society, on unemployment, social exclusion, inequitable distribution and consumption of energy, social breakdown, increased violence, a rise in new forms of social aggression, drug trafficking, growing drug use, and the loss of identity. So the Pope pretty well nails it. Technological innovation is not helping us that much. So he also feels that media and the digital world can stop people from learning how to live wisely, to think deeply, and to love generously. True wisdom, as the fruit of self-examination, dialogue, and generous encounter between persons. But social media shields us from direct contact with the pain, the fears, and the joys of others, and the complexity of their personal experiences. Oh, good. There's Bob Trapinski. Hey, Bob. Hey, Bob. I hope I didn't keep you waiting too long. Sorry about that. So that's social media. And then global inequality. Now, Father John has kind of suggested that this section could be covered more thoroughly at a later date and in another social concerns series. And I think Susan's planning on doing something like that. But I wanted to touch on a couple points from the chapter. The Pope says, today we have to realize that a true ecological approach always becomes a social approach. It must integrate questions of justice in debates on the environment so as to hear both the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. And then here's a quick synopsis of this whole section. He says the gravest effects are suffered by the poorest. The poor are the majority of the planet's population. Opinion makers are far removed from the poor. And he complains that economic assistance is often contingent on policies of reproductive health. And he says this is wrong. He says we cannot blame population growth instead of extreme and selective consumerism. And I believe he has a point. Too often we talk about the overpopulation of Earth, and still he does say attention needs to be paid to the imbalances of population density, especially Africa, where temperatures and drought have proved devastating to farming. Excuse me. And then he talks about multinationals, and they do there what they would never do here, leaving great environmental liabilities, such as the export of solid waste and toxic liquids to developing countries. He also talks about how the foreign debt of poor countries has become a way of controlling them. Yet this is not the case where ecological debt is concerned. In different ways, developing countries where the most important reserves of the biosphere are found continue to fuel the development of the richer countries at the cost of their own present and future. We could help pay this debt by significantly limiting their consumption of non-renewable energy and by assisting poorer countries to support policies and programs of sustainable development. We need to strengthen this conviction. And then the next chapter is titled Weak Responses. You know, our church is 2,000 years old, and Judaism is older still. But the Pope says, never have we hurt and mistreated our common home as we have in the last 200 years. He says we are called to be instruments of God our Father, so that our planet might be what he desired when he created it. The failure of global summits on the environment make it plain that our politics are subject to technology and finance. Any genuine attempt by groups within society to introduce change is viewed as a nuisance based on romantic illusions or an obstacle to be circumvented. It gets called a hoax, a conspiracy, liberal overreach. And it has nothing to do with any of those things. This is related to everybody. People may well have a growing ecological sensitivity, but it has not succeeded in changing their harmful habits of consumption, which rather than decreasing appear to be growing all the more. And then I was amused when the Pope said, an outsider looking at our world would be amazed at such behavior, which at times appears self-destructive. So priority tends to be given to speculation and the pursuit of financial gain. And we fail to take into account effects on human dignity and the natural environment. Environmental deterioration and human and ethical degradation are closely linked. Distractions constantly dull our consciousness of just how limited and finite our world really is. Once depleted, the scene will be set for new wars, albeit under the guise of noble claims. War always does grave harm to the environment. Laboratory research continues to develop new offensive weapons capable of altering the balance of nature. What would induce anyone to hold on to power only to be remembered for their inability to take action when it was urgent and necessary? But on a positive note, he says, in some countries, rivers have been cleaned up, native woodlands restored, landscapes renewed, beautiful buildings erected, advances of non-polluting energy, and improvement in public transportation. These achievements, though, do not solve global problems, but they do show that men and women are still capable of intervening positively. We're tempted to think that what is happening is not entirely clear, And then such evasiveness serves as a license to carrying on with our present lifestyles and models of production and consumption. We're delaying the important decisions by pretending that nothing is happening. So chapter 7, there's a variety of opinions out there. Different approaches and lines of thoughts have emerged. At one extreme, ecological problems will solve themselves. And at the other extreme, the presence of human beings on the planet should be reduced. We can always do something to solve our problems, but things are reaching a breaking point. And that's evident in the large-scale natural disasters, as well as social and even financial crises. If we scan the regions of our planet, we immediately see that humanity has disappointed God's expectations. So this is the end of chapter 1, and I'm going to move right on to lines of approach so that we can then get to our discussion. So chapter 5 is lines of approach. And there are 5 parts. The first and the fourth are the longest and the most, there's just a lot of serious thinking that goes on in this chapter. And so he says, so far I've attempted to take stock of our present situation. Now we shall try to outline the major paths of dialogue which can help us escape the spiral of self-destruction which currently engulfs us. Okay. The negative effects of certain lifestyles and models of production and consumption which affect us all motivates us to ensure that solutions are proposed from a global perspective and not simply to defend the interest of a few countries. Interdependence obliges us to think of one world with a common plan. Enormous technological progress has so far proved incapable of finding effective ways of dealing with grave environmental and social problems worldwide. A global consensus is essential for confronting the deeper problems. So as you can see, we're going to probably get into some difficult discussions. The Pope is really asking us to step out of our kind of nationalistic mindset. So the use of highly polluting fossil fuels, especially coal, but also oil, and to a lesser degree gas, needs to be progressively replaced without delay. The Pope makes it very clear. The international community has not reached adequate agreements about the responsibility for paying the cost of this energy transition. And that's a lot of what we're going to be talking about. There is reason to hope that humanity at the dawn of the 21st century will be remembered for having generously shouldered its grave responsibilities. Some recent world summits that have not lived up to their expectations were gone into in Laudato Si by the Pope. You know, reducing greenhouse gases requires honesty, courage, and responsibility. It cannot make significant progress due to positions taken by countries which place their national interests above the global common good. We believers cannot fail to ask God for a positive outcome to the present discussions so that future generations will not have to suffer the effects of our ill-advised delays. Another issue is the internationalization of environmental costs, which would risk imposing on countries with fewer resources burdensome commitments oops, I just messed up my view. Burdensome commitments reducing emissions comparable to those of more industrialized countries. I mean, that's not fair. They don't have the resources or the economies to support that. The bishops in Bolivia said the countries which have benefited from a high degree of industrialization at the cost of enormous emissions of greenhouse gases have a greater responsibility for providing a solution to the problems they have caused. And I show this graph of the world's economy to give us a pretty good idea of who's responsible, and probably directly who has created the most emissions. So for poor countries, they require the help of countries that have experienced great growth at the cost of the ongoing pollution of the planet. The cost of this would be low compared to the risks of climate change. And that's the most important point of all. You know, it may not seem fair that the United States has to pay more or that Europe has to pay more, but to not do so, it would be deadly. It would be the end of us. Enforceable international agreements are urgently needed. The growing problem of marine waste. What is needed, in effect, is an agreement on systems of governance for the whole range of so-called global commons. And I'm going to show a slide on that. We're witnessing a weakening of the power of nation states, chiefly because the economic and financial sectors, being transnational, tends to prevail over the political. When they exist in multiple countries, they trump any one country. So we need a true world political authority. And that's what the Pope's saying. And here's a slide I found that talks about the global commons. You know, what are some of those things? The great oceans, blood banks, the human genome, the internet, human rights, recipes, tribal dance, regional flora and fauna. You know, this is a global commons. And these are the kind of things that need to be discussed. So in the second chapter, individual states can no longer ignore their responsibility for planning, coordination, oversight, and enforcement within their respective borders. How can a society plan and protect its future amid constantly developing technological innovations? And that's a huge problem. So we need one authoritative source of oversight and coordination. Considerations would be foresight and security, regulatory norms, timely enforcement, the elimination of corruption, the reduction of pollution by business activities, effective responses to undesired side effects of production processes, appropriate intervention where potential or uncertain risks are involved. A politics concerned with immediate results, reluctant to upset the public with measures that could affect the level of consumption, is an obstacle. We are always more effective when we generate processes rather than holding on to positions of power. He says, with true statecraft, we uphold high principles and think of the long-term common good. And political powers do not find it easy to assume this duty. In some places, cooperatives are being developed to utilize renewable sources of energy and ensure local self-sufficiency and even the sale of surplus energy, while the existing world order proves powerless to assume its responsibilities. Unless citizens control political power, national, regional, and municipal, it will not be possible to control damage to the environment. And he also talks about local legislation would be more effective if agreements exist between neighboring communities. And I think there's something like that going on in Kansas City with their environmental group. And in fact, Lawrence has joined that. And imagine if Topeka joined and, you know, we all got a similar set of requirements for energies, for instance. So each country or region has its own problems and limitations, so there's no uniform recipes. Political realism may call for transactional measures and technologies, so long as these are accompanied by the gradual framing and acceptance of binding commitments. So Transitional measures are okay as long as we are moving towards acceptance of binding commitments. The Pope suggests some very concrete ideas on the national and local level, favoring forms of industrial production with maximum energy efficiency, diminished use of raw materials, removing from the market products which are less energy efficient and more polluting, improving transport systems, construction and repair of buildings aimed at reducing their energy consumption and levels of pollution. On the local level, modifying consumption, developing an economy of waste disposal and recycling, protecting certain species, planning a diversified agriculture and the rotation of crops. And in poorer regions, he says rural infrastructures to defend the interests of small producers and preserve local ecosystems from destruction, access to local and national markets, systems of irrigation, sustainable agriculture. These are wonderful ideas. But he says continuity is essential. Results take time and demand immediate outlays, which may not produce tangible efforts within any one government's term. That's why Citizens Climate Lobby is always looking for bipartisan solutions to climate, because parties change in power. In the absence of pressure from the public, political authorities will always be reluctant to intervene. If they're courageous, they will attest to the God-given dignity and leave behind a testimony of selfless responsibility, and that's politicians. In chapter 3 on decision-making, the forms of corruption which conceal the actual environmental impact of a given project in exchange for favors usually produce specious agreements. So he suggests from the beginning, these agreements should be made between the different stakeholders. And he suggests we should stop thinking in terms of interventions to these problems to save the environment in favor of policies developed and debated by all interested parties. A number of questions need to be asked. What will it accomplish? Why? Where? When? How? For whom? What are the risks? What are the costs? Who will pay those costs and how? To protect the most vulnerable and whose ability to defend their interests and to assemble incontrovertible evidence is limited. So we got to stand up for them. And I wanted to remind everybody once again that integral, the Pope's talking about an integral ecology. Integral, the definition is necessary to make a whole complete, essential, fundamental. That's what integral is. We need an integral ecology. So he suggests an honest and open debate so that particular interests or ideologies will not prejudice the common good. Chapter 4, politics must not be subject to the economy. Now there's a tough one and something that's going to require us to have some discussion. The dictates of efficiency-driven paradigm of technology is just not working. Production is not always rational. As we found out in 2008 and 9, it does not necessarily correspond to their real worth. And the real economy is just not confronted with rigor. We just let it do its thing, the free market. Is it realistic to hope that those who are obsessed with maximizing profits will stop to reflect on the environmental damage which they will leave behind for future generations? Efforts to promote a sustainable use of natural resources are not a waste of money, but rather an investment capable of providing other economic benefits in the medium term. It's a matter of openness to different possibilities which do not involve stifling human creativity and its ideals of progress, but rather directing energy along those channels. So now we're going to be talking kind of what the Pope is suggesting as far as changing our society, changing our economy, changing our employment opportunities. And he's talking about a path of productive development which is more creative and better directed versus excessive technological investment. It can generate intelligent and profitable ways of reusing, revamping, and recycling. Productive diversification offers the fullest possibilities to human ingenuity to create and innovate while protecting the environment and creating more sources of employment. Such creativity would be an expression of our most noble human qualities, for we would be striving intelligently, boldly, and responsibly to promote a sustainable and equitable development within the context of a broader concept of quality of life. On the other hand, to find ever new ways of despoiling nature purely for the sake of new consumer items and quick profit would be, in human terms, less worthy and creative and more superficial. So, politics and economy and dialogue for human fulfillment. Given the insatiable and irresponsible growth produced over many decades, we need to think of containing growth by setting some reasonable limits and even retracing our steps before it's too late. Reflection on the meaning of the economy and its goals with an eye to correcting its malfunction and misapplications. A technological and economic development which does not leave in its wake a better world and an integrally higher quality of life cannot be considered progress at all. In the midst of economic growth, talk of sustainable growth usually becomes a way of distracting attention and offering excuses. The social and environmental responsibility of businesses often gets reduced to a series of marketing and image-enhancing measures. And I put that guy up there because he looks like the most trustworthy guy in the world. So the clearing of a forest increases production, but they only pay a fraction of the costs involved. When the economic and social costs of using up shared environmental resources are recognized, those actions can be considered ethical, otherwise not. Some economic sectors exercise more power than states themselves, as was mentioned before. Pope says the mindset that leaves no room for sincere concern for the environment is the same mindset that lacks concern for the inclusion of the most vulnerable members of society. He says politics and the economy tend to blame each other, but he appeals to them, saying unity is greater than conflict. Politics and the economy need to come together on this issue. And then this amazing statement, and I'm going to read it in its entirety because I think it's so great. I even posted it on my Facebook yesterday. He says, what is needed is a politics that is far-sighted and capable of a new, integral, and interdisciplinary approach to handling the different aspects of the crisis. Often, politics itself is responsible for its disrepute, in which it is held on account of corruption and the failure to enact sound public policies. If in a given region the state does not carry out its responsibilities, some business groups can come forward in the guise as benefactors, wield real power, and consider themselves exempt from certain rules, to the point of tolerating different forms of organized crime, human trafficking, the drug trade, and violence, all of which become very difficult to eradicate. If politics shows itself incapable of breaking such a perverse logic and remains caught up in inconsequential discussions, we will continue to avoid facing the major problems of humanity. A strategy for real change calls for rethinking processes in their entirety, for it is not enough to include a few superficial ecological considerations while failing to question the logic that underlies present-day culture. A healthy politics needs to be able to take up this challenge. And then the final chapter, religions in dialogue with science. It cannot be maintained that empirical science provides a complete explanation of life. It would be quite simplistic to think that ethical principles present themselves purely in the abstract, detached from any context, meaning religion. Ethical principles find expression in a variety of languages, including religious language. Any technical solution will be powerless to solve the serious problems of our world if humanity loses its compass. Believers themselves must constantly feel challenged to live in a way consonant with their faith and not to contradict it by their actions. To draw constantly on their deepest convictions about love, justice, and peace. What a Pope we have. Ah. The majority of people living on our planet profess to be believers. This is my final slide. This should spur religions to building networks of respect and fraternity. And he says dialogue among the various sciences is likewise needed, since each tend to be enclosed in its own language, while specialization leads to a certain isolation and an absolutization of its own field of knowledge. And this prevents us from confronting environmental problems effectively. He even says an open and respectful dialogue is also needed between the various ecological movements, among which ideological conflicts are not infrequently encountered. The gravity of the ecological crisis demands that we all look to the common good, embarking on a path of dialogue which demands patience, self-discipline, and generosity, always in keeping in mind that realities are greater than ideas. And that's something for the Pope to say. We have got to deal with the reality that we're faced with, not just on ideas that we have about how things should be. So that wraps things up. I wonder, Patricia, would you mind reading this final prayer that the Pope gave us at the end of Laudato Si?
Yes, I will. Thank you. A prayer for our earth. All-powerful God, you are present in the whole universe and in the smallest of your creatures. You embrace with your tenderness all that exists. Pour out upon us the power of your love, that we may protect life and beauty. Fill us with peace, that we may live as brothers and sisters, harming no one. O God of the poor, help us to rescue the abandoned and forgotten of this earth, so precious in your eyes. Bring healing to our lives, that we may protect the world and not prey on it, that we may sow beauty, not pollution and destruction. Touch the hearts of those who look only for gain at the expense of the poor and the earth. Teach us to discover the worth of each thing, to be filled with awe and contemplation, to recognize that we are profoundly united with every creature as we journey toward your infinite light. We thank you for being with us each day. Encourage us, we pray, in our struggle for justice, love, and peace. Amen.
All right. That is a fitting ending for Laudato Si. I love that. So you guys can either sign off or we can have a discussion. I pulled up a few questions that we could kick around. You know, he really hit us up with some tough stuff. I mean, he's almost talking about a world order, which just drives certain Americans crazy. And it's a shame because we're in a heck of a fix and it's getting worse. And really the only answer is for us all to pull together. And those of us that can help more, help more. Does anybody like this set of questions, or do we want to talk about last week's questions a little more? What's the consensus? I'm gonna ask everybody to unmute.
Well, I had a question about Multinationals. I've not heard that term before. I've heard multinationals. Is
Right.
that the same thing or?
I would guess. I think it's the Pope's term.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah, I got greedy. I haven't seen that either.
Sorry?
Oh, yeah, I noticed that too. I was saying what Jean noticed at alternationals. I had not heard that.
Right, right. Well, you know, the big part of this chapter 5, after looking at, you know, what the dire situation that we're in is, really talks about, you know, should politicians be held accountable? Should political parties be held accountable? He doesn't say that. I say that. Why did we pull out of the Paris Accord? You know, why do we have this globalization of indifference? Does money hold too much sway? Does business hold too much sway? What is the meaning of the economy and what should be its goals? You know, when the founding fathers set up our economy, what did they want it to be? What do they want corporations to be? Anybody have any insights on that?
It's like we have to go back to the root understanding of the term economy, right? Rather than capitalism where everything just freely is undirected and
well, it all goes to a few people.
that's right.
Over time, it just keeps concentrating at the top.
And no one has the courage to or the right attitude. Our leaders don't have, well, some of them do, but our current president certainly doesn't have the, I mean, why did we pull out of the Paris Accord? It was his, why did we let him do that? Do we have any power to pull back on these things? I don't know.
That would be nice to know. I mean, you know, maybe the president has too much power, as we're finding out.
Yes, indeed.
Could I ask a question here? Aren't we still in it for a little while longer? So if we have a different president after the election, maybe we can stay in it?
I think he can, I think we can formally withdraw in December.
In December. Okay, well.
So if Trump does that, you know, that would be, well, I mean, it just depends, I guess. Maybe he won't if he's not reelected. But I think, go ahead.
I did not quite understand that. Withdraw, we've already withdrawn, haven't we, from the Paris Accord?
Yeah, but there was a 3-year or, you know, a certain period that had to transpire.
Okay, so we want to go back to the Paris Accord, right? Not withdraw.
Well, yes, we do. And that's, you know, that's the question. Why did we withdraw? And I think it was more for petty reasons, but I don't know. There is a toxic denial in upper levels of the president's party. And I think most of us are pretty aware of why that is, you know, and it's just a matter of whether we agree with it or not. It's a toughie. It's a toughie. I do believe that Joe Biden is planning to put us back into the Paris Accord if he gets elected. But
I think it's true, yeah.
There's so much we could have been doing in the last 4 years that we haven't done and that the world hasn't done because we weren't participating. Right. It's going to take you know, we're really going to have to pour on the coal. And I think that means, you know, looking at the way that we live. I mean, that was a question last week is what does the Pope mean towards a new lifestyle? And, you know, this is no small shakes. It's a pretty big deal. And, you know, the thing that I was struck by most going through this very hard 2 chapters was how similar what the Pope is talking about Kansas City's effort is to this. And it's almost like my friends Lindsay Constance and Mike Lee, who started the climate, oh gosh, I can't even think of the name of their organization, but they had several hundred people come to Johnson County Community College. Several hundred leaders come and discuss the thing. But I really think they patterned a lot of it after Laudato Si. And, you know, I think that if communities can embrace this kind of thing, that's the way that, you know, the movement could get rolling nationwide.
From the ground, yes.
Yep, from the ground up.
Ground up.
And fortunately, the city council in Lawrence has joined their group, and the city council is considering endorsing a carbon bill that we that I have worked the last 10 years to promote. You know, so there's some good signs around Lawrence and Kansas City. You know, and my hope in doing this, honestly, is that there's 200,000 to 400,000 Catholics in the state of Kansas. And, you know, I don't know how long they can hide from this thing. I feel like they are hiding from it, and they're diving for cover every time it's brought up, except Bob Trapinski.
But it's that passivity that we Americans are so, we tend to be so passive. When you look at the people in Russia and in, where was the other demonstration? There are thousands of people out in the streets asking for what they want.
Yeah.
We just don't do that in our country. We don't get out there.
I don't think it's that bad here, actually, but
Oh,
we've got racial problems, that's for sure. And
that's for sure.
I think they're bubbling to the surface. They got a little too much headwind in recent years and got a little out of control. Is my opinion, but that's just mine. But I don't know, you know, the one of the issues we have is should our country pay more than other countries? You know, and that's a tough stickling point. That was never addressed in the Paris Accord.
I think that was one reason Trump gave of wanting to get out of the Paris Accord, because he had to pay more, right? I think that's wrong. I think we should pay more. We're richer.
That's right.
Well, we're way richer, and we had much more to do with it than anybody.
Mm-hmm.
And we're wealthy because of that. And like the Pope says, it won't be nearly as expensive as climate change is going to be. Climate change will, well, you know, I read a deal last night that said, okay, the tobacco industry was in denial for all those years, and they lied to us even though they knew it caused cancer. And, you know, that was one thing. It killed people. But the fossil fuel industry and the people that support the fossil fuel industry, by denying climate change, they're not killing people, they're killing a civilization. They're wiping out the human civilization, potentially.
They're wiping out much of the environment too, along with us.
Well, right. And I mean, you know, without the environment, civilization can't exist. And, you know, nature will come back, you know, 1 million years from now or so. But you know, God gave us this creation, and we're destroying it. So, you know, I think it's a tough question right off the cuff, but it's something we should be thinking about. You know, should we pay more? Should we help the other nations that can't afford to adapt? Is basically what that question is.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And without putting, you know, population restraints on them or, you know, saddling them with debt. we owe it to the world to address this problem. Now,
Yes.
we can't address all their problems, but this is one that we can address.
Well, you think of the poorer nations as they try and electrify systems and things like that. If the developed countries could agree to assist the poorer countries to predominantly use solar and wind and those type of issues to
Absolutely.
develop their grids as opposed to
Coal.
fossil fuels.
Yeah.
You know, I've seen some data. I don't have it handy with me right now that in the state of Kansas, we have capacity of wind and natural gas to generate our power up to about 75 or 80%. But we're unfortunately using coal for almost 46%. And this is probably from about 2016, the data that I had.
Yeah.
And we could easily, I mean, we have more capacity to use in those others, but we don't bring them online.
Right.
You know, it's like, we'll just hold that in reserve for, high peaks, et cetera, as opposed to why don't we run those and keep the coal as the backup for
Right.
the high peak, et cetera, to minimize the emissions. I mean, the cost of, I was involved when we had an incinerator at the hospital, and I think there were 10 hospitals in the state that burn hazardous waste. And we were using natural gas, but a lot of the things that the hospital uses were plastics naturally. And so we had to get environmental sensors and scrubbers installed. And right after we got all that done, our state government decided that there really should only be, I think there's only 2 or 3 incinerators in the whole state now burning hazardous materials. So everybody, all the hospitals had to shut theirs down and go to transporting that waste to those central locations.
Did it chap you off when they did that?
Pardon?
Did it chap you when they did that?
Well, we were watching all the emissions very closely and staying within limits. I mean, it was expensive to do that, but it was cheaper, and we felt we were doing better than sending stuff like that to the landfill.
Yeah.
Under special situations.
Sounds
So,
like it was a step forward.
It was more, well, we've got a sunk cost already, turning off the gas and you turned off the gas anytime you weren't burning anyway. So turning it off, it was just like a sunk cost, like an outdated piece of technology that sits there.
Yeah.
And you pay for a truck coming up and picking things up and hauling it away. But and then you pay them to burn it at the central location.
Sure. Well, I
But-
think we're going to be finding hundreds and thousands of situations just like that we're going to have to deal with. That, the old way of doing things are going to get antiquated, and it's going to suck.
Right now, I think the city this year had passed a resolution and signed up to utilize, I think, wind power as their primary electrical source.
Right.
And we're paying a couple pennies, I guess, more than what we would have been before. But over time, that's going to go under
Yeah.
and be cheaper. I see that as a good long-term move because they can control the common zones and common costs and
Right.
try and run the city as economically and environmentally as they can.
Right.
Right, right.
So I think, I think the point of this chapter is that we need to take a whole new approach with our politics and, treating our economy like we always have and, looking out for the interests of business is not what we're here for.
That's right.
I mean, that's a hard pill to swallow when you're a businessman. And there, businesses could probably, well, they have been, Chamber of Commerce has been completely against action on climate change, and
Oh,
huge amounts of money have been spent, framing it as a liberal money grab and all those kind of, ugly names. But what it really is facing facts.
and I think we have to get world leaders on deck with this. I mean, how can we get a hold of this huge problem if
Right.
our leaders are not talking to one another
Well,
about a global attitude
right.
instead of a national attitude? And
You know-
what about these G7 meetings? Aren't they international meetings where these things can be discussed or not?
Well, of course, and they do, and France and Germany and Canada are all over it, even Britain. But the United States has been missing in action. I mean, really not participating.
Oh,
And so that's our problem right now. And hopefully that's going to change.
oh,
But
that's-
we are such an economy-driven country. I mean, our economy is everything to us.
and it's not right. It's not ethical.
Well, it's not. It's unfortunate.
Huh?
It's served us really well up until now, but it is destroying our planet. And I guess the hardest problem is getting people to believe that.
Uh-huh.
And it's something they don't want to believe. They're not going to believe it. No matter if the ice packs melt and all of South America comes up across our borders, they're just not going to believe it.
And that's where the globalization of indifference comes in.
That's right.
How do we tackle that one?
With the Pope, I think the Pope is second only to the Gospels. And if Catholics don't believe that, then they ought to go join the Protestants. And if that's, and if their capitalism means that much to them, that's where they ought to go. But, obviously we're not there because, there is a conservative Catholicism in this country that has not embraced climate.
Yeah.
Huh?
And that was my motivation in doing this. I don't know what to do. I did want to delve into this deeper, and I had just fallen in love with the deep dive that the Pope has done with this thing. I mean, he really paints a vision for the world that's beautiful.
It is. It's the first bit of encouragement that it's like we've got a structure now. We all have to buy into it.
That's it. That's right. That's right.
And
a lot of groups have, like the Paris Accord has tried.
or a vision. We've got a vision now.
Right.
Now it's up to the leaders to see the common good here.
Yeah. People over at Plymouth Church have embraced this more than people at St. John's.
Is that so?
Oh yeah.
In what way?
Oh, they've had all kinds of classes on Laudato Si, and their environmental groups are active and they do things. We don't have an environmental group at St. John's. No, and
Wow.
we had a thing for a little while called the Climate Care Group, and unfortunately, I kind of didn't. I went at one time and I was just so disappointed that all they were doing was talking about getting plastic silverware and plates. And so I was extremely impatient with that first meeting.
Uh-huh.
And, I guess I need to realize, it's those little actions that slowly build a consciousness for this thing. And, people aren't going to get the idea of changing their lifestyle and their consumption and their use of plastic and their making 3 trips to the grocery store in 2 days. They're not going to grasp that overnight. It takes a long time for people to get that kind of idea.
It seems like we have to work at both ends, locally, but then
Yeah.
we have to be thinking globally too.
Yeah.
That's what was missing when you went, was the whole vision, it sounds like. Yeah.
Well, that's mighty big talk, and it's probably too big a talk for us. I mean, because we can't influence anybody on that level. But we can talk to fellow Catholics and
Right.
get them comfortable with that idea. I think our president in the future, might embrace more of these kinds of things if given the opportunity. And future presidents, but it's going to take citizens embracing,
Asking for it. Oh, we've got to. Yes.
ecological conversion, which is the thing about plastic spoons and forks, and then here on this bigger level, getting comfortable with the idea and not opposing it. I think that's the most important thing, is not opposing the idea of a Paris Accord, of business holding sway over society too much, having too much say, having, the economy being the driving force about what life is. I mean, life is so much more than the economy. Life is
Yes.
is caring about your neighbor and caring about one another and caring about the poor and forwarding the ideals of Christianity. It's not having the most toys. And then this idea of wealthy nations paying more. I mean, let's face it, it's probably going to boil down to the rich paying more. And that's okay with me.
Yeah.
I mean,
I agree.
they've already, amassed way more than they need. And, but, that's the kind of things that we're going to have to embrace without being judgmental and ideological. I think the Pope's just saying, let's look at the facts. Let's look at the situation and let's do what we need to do and not lean back on our old ideologies that have been driven in our heads. And there's liberal ideologies and there's conservative ideologies. I think we just need to do,
Yeah, it's a matter of survival. We just have to do it.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. Oh my gosh, it's 8:15. I think we better wrap it up, guys. Would you guys be interested in having possibly a new climate care group where we discuss some of these things in an orderly fashion and and maybe set some goals for ourselves?
I almost feel like we need to do more study or something of how to get a handle on this whole thing. I mean, it's so enormous, I guess.
Yeah.
Where do we start? Maybe we do need that. Right now, Justice Matters is taking a lot of my energy, so I'm hesitant to on how often were you thinking?
I'm not even thinking. I don't know. I
You
have
hadn't
no,
thought-
I have no thoughts. You know, I'm maybe
Yeah.
off, maybe after the new year.
Oh, I think once a month I could certainly do. I'd
Yeah,
be willing to
well, that's-
commit to once a month.
I
Yeah.
would too. I would too. You know, and I'm not even sure I want to lead, but I would. You know, I think there's some other people in our church that have, you know, real environmental chops. But I think possibly we could use these slideshows that I put together as frameworks to go back
Oh, yeah.
and refer to. I can provide these slides to you so that you can just flip through them at your convenience if you want them. And, you know, I would even encourage people to think about maybe presenting these kind of things to friends, you know, sitting down with a group of 3 or 4 friends and saying, hey, you know, let's flip through some of these ideas. Maybe you could condense it further. I mean, you know, I narrowed it down as far as I could without leaving out anything that I thought was important.
And right now, you know, COVID-19 doesn't help us with that, but because of the lack of social connection, you know, but as soon as things do open up, and of course we could have a Zoom meeting on this.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Instead of meeting in homes, you know, we could just say, can you just give an hour on Sunday to a session? Yeah.
Susan sent me this thing a while back. It says, we will not go back to normal. Normal never was. Our pre-corona existence was not normal, other than we normalized greed, inequality, exhaustion, depletion, and extraction.
Wow.
Yeah, really.
we should not long to return, my friends. We are being given an opportunity to stitch a new garment, one that fits all of humanity and nature.
Great. Wow. Was this a quote or was
I don't know. It was just I think Susan sent it to me. Somebody sent it to me and I thought, yeah. You know, I mean, it is going to be, we're going to have a real tough time coming out of this in the economy. There's so many people unemployed and, you know, it's not going to be happy days are here again.
But maybe it's the right moment to start something new, as she said. I mean, to take a new look at everything.
It is on a local level, you know.
If we look at it creatively and positively instead of this awful pandemic, if we see what are the possibilities of change here.
Right. Yeah.
Moving in a new direction. Right.
Yeah. No, I think, you know, looking at doing some of these kinds of things, modifying consumption, developing an economy of waste disposal and recycling. You know, I don't even think when the city comes around and picks up our waste, I don't think they're recycling it. I think they're carrying it right out to the landfill.
Tony, you need to ask for a special recycling container. Like
no, I have one. I have one, and they come and take it.
Yeah, I mean, you can get it for the church too. Is what I'm trying to say. That's what we did at.
Oh yeah, right. That kind of thing. So these are the kind of ideas we could discuss as a group. And, you know, how can we modify consumption as individuals in Lawrence, Kansas, and in a region? And how can we develop an economy, you know, and diversified agriculture and the like, so that we're not trucking everything in. So we're driving less and living life more fully.
Yes.
All right.
That's a good ending, I'd say.
Well, I'll approach you guys later on and see if you're interested. And if you're not, that's okay. But I do think St. John's ought to have some kind of presence.
Absolutely.
In this environmental thing. It seems embarrassing. Susan has told me several families have left because we don't have anything environmental. We're not socially active in that way.
Yeah. Yeah, well, let me just point out one thing here, like, let us group United for
Ministers.
Sustainability. We would like for you to send somebody from St. John to our meetings with, Thad Holcomb.
Yeah, that's that's me. And that's a pretty
you're
li-
fine. Okay. You are.
yeah, that's a pretty light contribution by
Yeah,
this.
of course, we're not having actual meetings. We're Zoom meetings. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I would say that's kind of like the minimum thing to say we're members of that group. You know, there,
I thought that was a clergy group, Lettuce. Isn't it a clergy group?
no,
No.
It's mostly lay people like me.
and they're doing
Oh.
a lot of good things on the local level, fighting for things that are worthwhile, and they're a worthwhile organization. But St. John's can't claim to be a participant if it just sends one person there.
Oh, well, that's kind of the way that it works. I'm the only one that goes through Trinity. Yeah.
I think that there's a lot bigger participation in other churches. I could be wrong, but there certainly is in Kansas City. And, I think it's a great way to get young people involved because they're concerned about this. But it takes people to make it happen. And, these things don't just happen magically. It takes some committed people. So I'll send out feelers later on and see if anybody is interested in, a Care for Creation group.
And maybe we could get a Kansas City, maybe they could come and show us what they're doing.
Absolutely.
Maybe we could share a little bit at one of our meetings.
Yeah.
We could have a joint gathering so that we can find out how to begin to get handles on these topics. Yeah.
Great idea. Let's find a group that's successful and have them teach us.
Yeah. Or at least tell us what directions they've taken. And then our community may be different, but at least
right.
We would have some hope, maybe.
Amen, sister.
Okay, well, Tony, thank you a million for these 4 sessions.
Well,
I
thank
can't
you guys.
imagine the time involved. Oh, I can't.
I've loved it. I really have, and I'm glad it's done.
I bet you are.
But it's been a joy, and it's really been nice to have you guys participate. And
thank you, Tony. It's been really nice to revisit this. We read it in our group, but it came out. But I really enjoyed discussing it with you.
Absolutely.
Thank you to each of you. Thanks, Pat.
Okay. You have a
Thanks,
good
Tony.
Bye-bye. You too.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
Bye, Bob and Bill.
Take care.
All right. And Thad. Bye-bye.
Oh, it was Thad was there? Oh, yeah. Okay.
That was yeah. Thad, not Thad, Tad.
Oh, Thad, not Thad.
Tad
Okay.
Kramer. Tad and Margaret. Tad plays the mandolin at 11 o'clock.
Oh, okay. Okay, bye.
Okay. Bye, you guys.